Today's episode in some ways marks a major transition in the podcast thus far. We finished off with the last episode, a warning from the Senator Cassius Dio, imploring the emperors of his day to change course in order to avoid a calamity. Well, as we'll see in today's episode, that calamity may have hit beginning around 235 AD. But before we get into the narrative history of this tumultuous period, I want to address the big picture. Historians are still to this day unsure as to whether we can really call the 3rd century a period of crisis. Or was it more of a transformation? Yes, a rocky period in Roman history, but one in which the fundamental institutions of the empire continued to work and function. They maybe just changed their form in some ways. So let's talk about the big picture of the 3rd century crisis on today's episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 72, The Crisis of the 3rd Century AD. I just want to say thanks for listening to the podcast. We're picking up a steady stream of new followers every day, really. And if you haven't listened to the earlier episodes of the podcast, let me just put in a plug. This is almost like an audiobook in many ways, hours and hours and hours of history, starting from the death of Julius Caesar all the way to where we are today with the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century. You can go back and check out those episodes. They're about 20 to 30 minutes in length. It's certainly been fun to record, and I've really enjoyed getting the positive feedback from so many listeners. Thanks so much for your support. If you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast, please do so. Let me know what you think also with a comment or liking the podcast on whatever podcast app that you use to get the Pax Romana podcast. And, another thing you can do if you wish is tell a few friends. Either way, thanks for listening. Let's get to today's episode. The crisis of the 3rd century is meant to take place between the years AD 235 and 284-285. It's a 50-year period in which the Roman Empire appears to have gone through a significant transformation in a variety of areas, from culture to economy, politics, military, religion. There's a lot that changes in the space of that 50 years. And so the period is a messy one. It is in some ways very difficult to follow. It's still the case, for example, that we don't know the names of all of the usurpers and would-be emperors in this period. Occasionally, a coin is found, for example, that dates from this period that bears the name of an emperor that we either didn't know existed or whose existence was at least questioned by some historians. Coin evidence, by the way, is really important for the crisis of the 3rd century because the literary accounts are so unreliable and sparse. A lot of the written evidence comes from papyrological records from Egypt, and then there are also inscriptions that illuminate the period a little bit in bursts, but with significant gaps as well. And as I alluded to in my introduction, a majority of scholars think of this period as a crisis. I happen to write my PhD focusing on this period, and I would say that that is largely my view as well. But that doesn't mean there aren't some significant problems with this view, or at least some questions that are worth asking. For example, to what extent does the focus on particular kinds of events and phenomena influence the way that historians think about this period? This is a very important question. If we focus on politics and economics and demographics, for example, then it really does look like a crisis. There are no imperial dynasties during this period. No emperor is able to really successfully establish unquestioned, unthreatened transfer of power from father to son, whether natural son or adopted, in the ways that we see with some of the dynasties in earlier periods of Roman history. Another issue that we see in kind of the political realm are constant border wars. The emperors, both unofficial and official, during the middle of the 3rd century are on the extremes of the empire, on the borders. And of course, while they are occupied with foreign wars, the home front is left undefended in many ways, opening up opportunities for usurpers to plot, conspire, and set off coups in the city of Rome or in other important regions of the Roman Empire. If, however, an emperor decides to stay in Rome and send a general or a legate or some representative off to the borderlands to fight some kind of rebellion or foreign war, then that emperor risks his legate gaining a following, winning a victory, and then deciding to proclaim himself emperor. In other words, there's really no fix in this period for the limited ability of emperors to be more than one place at one time. Physical presence seems to have mattered a lot in the middle of the 3rd century, and wherever an emperor was not, that was where his opposition often arose. And it goes without saying that there was regular civil war during this period. Some of it was very personal. As we'll go through the narrative history of this period, at least insofar as I can reconstruct it, we will see rivalries and vendettas for sure. We'll also just see practical politics, emperors accepting the fact that they can't rule the entire empire at once and having to make decisions. Do we fight foreigners and invaders, or do we fight civil wars? And often it had to be one or the other because resources were so limited and strained during this period. Over the top of all of this, there's one thing I also want you to notice, and that is the Senate just fade to the background. Cassius Dio, as we saw in the last episode, wrote his warning to the empire that the armies really should not have a prominent role. And he was, of course, speaking in one sense from a position of self-preservation. He could probably see that the influence of the Senate was diminishing dramatically. Well, in the crisis of the 3rd century, the role of the Senate is greatly reduced, and they will come out the other end with almost no real power whatsoever. Finally, with all of these armies roving about the Roman Empire, from border to border, from city to city, from region to region, fighting civil wars, fighting foreign wars, waging wars of usurpation, those armies had to be fed, they often desired plunder, and they often just took the resources that they needed or just desired from the populations in the area where they were. If they were in Roman territory, they sacked or pillaged Roman cities. So in addition to just the general strains of war in this period, the army was not even necessarily taking from foreigners. It was directly consuming the resources of the people on whose behalf the army was supposedly fighting. Roman resources were going to pay armies that were then destroying the resources of the empire itself. Not a good situation, obviously. And that gets to the economics of the 3rd century crisis. The drain on the empire's wealth was the most severe that it had ever been, probably by orders of magnitude. The military costs were very high. Multiple emperors at any given time with multiple armies all fighting each other. At this point, the kind of central structure for paying soldiers and giving out bonuses had largely evaporated. Instead, soldiers were relying on their individual emperors for their pay. And those emperors often didn't have access, at least immediately, to the gold and silver bullion that was necessary to mint coins. What do you do then? You have to stretch the existing silver and gold further. What we see in this period as a result then is the rapid debasement of the silver coinage and the reduction in the weight of the gold coinage. The monetary system itself, in fact, seems to have become localized. And it's unclear whether the coins bearing the name of an emperor from, say, Great Britain or Gaul would be accepted in other parts of the empire, say in Syria or Judea. Weight standards and fineness standards for coins were all over the place, and there are some indications that the broader population may have found it easier to barter than to use Roman money. So the political situation was a mess, the economic situation was a mess, and then there's just kind of the demographic situation. Obviously, the constant warfare was putting downward pressure on the overall population because people were dying, both soldiers and citizens who were being killed by soldiers. But it's also the case that during this period, and indeed just before it, we see a series of plagues, famines, and other natural calamities that especially affected urban populations, dropping the population number in Roman cities. War and natural disasters create refugees. Refugees migrate, both migrants who originated from within the empire, but of course, changing conditions on the borders of the Roman Empire were bringing people in numbers that were larger than ever before. As a result, we see radical shifts in the ownership of property, the ratio of urban peoples to rural peoples, and at least over the course of the entire period, there seems also to have been a major change in who the elite of the empire were. At the beginning of this period, Cassius Dio can still think of himself not only as a senator, but as a member of Rome's elite. And while the Senate do not go away after the 50 years of the crisis of the 3rd century, the military elite, officers, generals, have a much more prominent role, not only in terms of their power and influence in politics, but like their cultural influence. Instead of people imitating the senatorial upper classes in the way that they dress and cut their hair and wear their beards, they begin to imitate soldiers. The new elite that rise to power in this period have an increasingly important cultural influence. And that is true of religion as well. The types of cults and rituals and deities that soldiers are most interested in begin to replace many of the more traditional rituals, practices, and deities that had been prominent in the Roman Empire. And so far, you're probably thinking, well, this is obviously a very good case for crisis. How could anybody think that anything else happened during this period? But there is a sizable contingent of ancient historians that have been arguing, and I think very persuasively, for, yes, a period of regional crises and certainly some political, economic, and military disturbances, but overall a period in which there is still continuity of the most important structures and institutions in the Roman Empire. That in many ways, the period represents a set of adaptations that, although painful, allowed the Roman Empire to change and evolve in a way which ultimately led to its preservation rather than to its end. And some of the evidence for this view is the very same evidence I just gave you, only cast in a little bit of a different light. By major structures, I mean culture, religion, social arrangements. For example, there's plenty of art and architecture from this period. Temples are still being built, statues of emperors, but it is definitely the case that it kind of lacks the same aesthetic as from previous periods. The Roman state continues. Okay, yes, there's a shift in the power base from traditional elites, Roman senators and the traditional upper classes, to armies, their generals, and their officers. Okay, a different group wields state power. But the apparatuses, the institutions continue. There are still governors, there are still officials in charge of courts. The class of people are different, the way they might do things is different, but those basic institutions that we think of as markers of a civilization are still there. In other words, this is not civilizational collapse. It's a civilizational transformation. You can even see this if you zoom in on one particular group. Let's think about the armies, for example. Okay, the armies are fighting civil wars and foreign wars. A lot of soldiers are dying during this period, and there's a lot of other sources of death in this period as well. And yet, the Roman Empire, during this 50-year period of supposed crisis, is able to continue to fund and field those armies. This suggests that there is tremendous demographic and economic resilience in the Roman Empire. Okay, the currency is debased. okay, the types of soldiers change. Increasingly, for example, the Roman military is made up of migrants rather than men who come from generations of Roman citizens. That may be different, but the fact is, broadly speaking, the Roman Empire continues to field massive armies during this period that function as armies. And religion. Yes, it may have changed quite substantially in terms of the rituals and the types of deities worshipped. Certainly there's a lot of syncretism in this period as well, where Roman gods and more regional local gods are kind of mushed together as the makeup of the army continues to shift towards peoples from near or beyond the Roman borders, and they of course bring their deities with them. But even in the midst of this great religious transformation and increasing diversity, there is at the same time a growing push to unify the Roman Empire under very broad concepts of divinity. We saw this with Elagabalus, for example, and his worship of the sun god El-Gabal. Sun gods are in fact present in many of the local religions in and around the Roman Empire. And although the various sun deities are different, there is an increasing unification of worship around sort of the larger concept of a sun god, whoever that exactly may be. Now, the flip side of this growing unity, or kind of maybe even pluralism in the Roman Republic, is that the marginalized religions stick out all the more. With the boundaries of acceptable religion becoming increasingly vague and broad, then the people that won't still participate in such an inclusive religious regime seem especially antisocial, uncompromising, rigid, and there is simply less tolerance for such people. Obviously, the main group that still will not participate, even as religion broadens, are the Christians. Of course, there are still plenty of nominal Christians during this period who are happy to worship a sun god and associate Jesus Christ with him, and we talked about this on a previous episode of the Pax Romana podcast. I'm thinking in particular of episode 62, Ancient Cultural Christianity. That was part 2 of my Christianity in the Pax Romana miniseries, so you can check that out for more on that topic. But the Christians that didn't accept this broadening and unifying view of religion became especially persecuted, and Christian persecution really ramps up in the 3rd century. But again, we'll get to that a bit later. So those are broadly the two views, and maybe at this point you're not convinced of either yet. You can see the case for both, and you don't have to be forced into making a decision. Although I certainly lean towards the crisis argument, as you can tell by the title of this podcast episode, I understand the arguments for transition and transformation, and I certainly am persuaded by some of them. As we'll see in the narrative that follows on the coming episodes, there is not a total crisis in the Roman Empire at this time. There are whole regions that actually do better, or at least don't do particularly bad, as far as we can tell, during the 3rd century. But at least when we focus on some of those key areas, as I mentioned earlier, politics, economy, military, the problems seem very severe and very widespread. And that's what I want to look at on the next episode. I want to focus on just how bad it was for the economy, for the political system, and for the military. We'll begin that deeper dive on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.